In the initial hectic mad dash of trying to order a Steam Deck, one decision I made that I kinda lightly regretted afterwards was not going for the largest storage size model. I went for the medium one, which I was like, yeah, that should have the load speeds I care about, and hey, if I need the extra space, I can just expand it, right? Right? If you're unfamiliar with the storage sizes the Steam Deck came in, there were 3 different sizes. There was a base model, 64 gig, that had an eMMC drive, basically the equivalent of using an SD card. Middle one, which is what I ordered, was a 256 gigabyte SSD, and the largest model offered the same style of SSD, but at twice the storage size of 512. There are some other differences between these models, for instance, what kind of physical goodies they come with, like different carrying cases. The largest one also comes with a non-reflective display, but I really just want to talk about my experience of using the 256 and ways I've managed my storage and whether or not you might really want to consider paying the extra to get that largest storage size if you're looking to grab one. First off, how quickly does that initial storage fill in? Well, in my case with the 256, turns out pretty quick, at least depending on what kind of games you're messing with on the system. Because the Steam Deck is, again, just kind of retrofitting the PC ecosystem into a Steam Deck handheld, there are certain kind of optimization choices that can't be made. For instance, if a game could have a lower res texture version downloaded because it's only going to make use of 800p, that's not the case here, it's just downloading the same large size option. So if you get a game that's fairly large, like say Doom Eternal at 80 gigs, it's still going to be 80 gigs even on the Steam Deck. Obviously though, of course, game sizes do vary a lot, especially depending on what kind of stuff you're into playing. For instance, if most of your library is really focused on indie titles, you probably don't need to be that worried about it, right? I mean, most of those games at most are a few gigs, sometimes getting up into the low double digits, but never to the kind of gigantic sizes that big AAA releases can be. If, however, your goal is to mostly focus on these kind of larger experiences, whether that's Doom Eternal, Elden Ring, or even, say, Starfield later this year, then yes, it's going to take up a very sizable portion of that storage, to the point where you might be realistically only installing 3 or 4 games at a time. Now, of course, being a PC-based handheld, and really just being any kind of gaming system today, the first thought a lot of people would have is, well, yeah, but you can expand this in some way, right? And you can. And there's basically 2 different main thought processes involved with how you could do this. There's the official way that Valve wants you to do it, and then there's the other option. The official way is making use of a micro SD card. The Steam Deck has a micro SD card slot. Once inserted, you can format it to work with the Steam Deck. This is the assumed method that Valve wants you to take. Whereas the other option, which obviously there are going to be some people who consider, is opening the Steam Deck up and replacing the SSD with a larger size variation. Now, while this is something that you can technically do, it is not something really that Valve encourages. This is the type of thing that is going to void your warranty, and not to mention, depending on your own skill level with this kind of stuff, might give you a lot of extra headaches. That being the case, I personally have gone with just using a micro SD card because, again, I really like messing with the Steam Deck in terms of sort of its intended use for the time being, just so that people who want to use it out of the box understand what that experience is like. And I gotta be honest, I wasn't that enthusiastic about making use of microSD for expansion. Just going off of my experiences with other game systems, right? I mean, I have an SSD in the Xbox Series X and PS5, and those allow for very fast load times. Whereas, say, if I'm loading stuff off of a microSD card in my Switch, it's not a very fast load time. And obviously there's a lot that goes into how this performs out of just simply what the storage technology itself is, but again, going off that kind of baseline experience, really thought I was going to be seeing some very different load speeds between the two, and after running a whole lot of tests, not really. The SSD is absolutely faster than microSD, but only in the sense that when you do these side-by-side comparisons of load times, it's always resulting in a lower number. But how much that number is lower by varies quite a bit, and there were actually even some cases where when I tested a particular game, there wasn't any difference at all. There's a lot of things that can play into this, how a particular game is optimized. There are some titles that, just rely on the fact that the lowest common denominator is going to be a hard drive, and therefore it's not really specializing for any kind of faster option. But really, when I expected to be seeing some very noticeable different speeds, none of the ones I got were appreciable in a way that made me go, man, I never want to use the SD card. My kind of baseline thought, and this still mostly holds true, is that, yeah, if it's a very large game that I know I'm going to be dealing with some substantial load times in, I want to make sure that's on the internal, and if it's a smaller indie game, that can go on the SD card. And while that is still a rule I follow, it's not really one that I feel like I need to be particularly dogmatic about. We ran multiple load time tests between a variety of different games, indie games, older titles on PC, larger scale games, open world adventures, and across the board, while the SSD was usually going faster than the microSD load times, it really wasn't to a point that felt painful. In multiple situations, you would see a difference of at most 5 seconds, which, yes, if we're talking about something that's already loading very fast, where the SD card is 8 seconds and the SSD is 3 seconds, yeah, the SSD is obviously a much more efficient, faster method, but that 5 seconds isn't exactly going to be a torturous experience. For the sake of clarity, the microSD card that we're using for these tests is actually one of the ones that is branded for the Nintendo Switch. The important point about this is that this particular microSD card does hit the maximum speeds that the Steam Deck supports. While most of the games were very close, there are a couple exceptions that I think are worth pointing out. Fallout 4 in particular had a much longer loading time on the SD card of 23 seconds versus 10 seconds off the internal, so over twice as long. And Elden Ring, while experiencing a bit longer load times of 18 seconds compared to 10 seconds internally, while loading off the SD card, also ran into the particular issue of failing to properly start up, requiring me to force the game closed and start it up again. This has so far been an isolated thing just with Elden Ring for me. I have not experienced this on any other games yet. And even with games that have significantly long loading times, I've tested a couple different games where loading screens took almost as long as 40 seconds, and in a lot of those cases, even when the SSD was faster, it was only faster by a few seconds, not any kind of night and day difference where you're going to really notice it with regular use. And so this really changed my feelings about my particular model Steam Deck, because what initially started as a sort of like, oh man, I'm filling this 256 up really fast, I really should have spent the more money to get the larger one, it just would have been a better overall experience. Now that I've really messed with these options though, that's not really the case. And don't get me wrong, every now and then, yeah, there is that little thought that a little extra internal storage would be nice, and hey, maybe that anti-glare coating would make a huge difference, but it's not the kind of grass is greener on the other side level where I'm really regretting my purchase, especially considering the relative affordability and how common microSD cards are. There's a healthy chance that you might already have one that you used with a previous bit of tech, or maybe even say a Nintendo Switch, and you can repurpose it for using with the Steam Deck, giving you that extra storage you need. And even when you look at the really expensive options out there, the amount of money you're paying to increase the storage size compared to how much extra you're paying to upgrade the Steam Deck is pretty good. I mean, right now you can look online and find a 1 terabyte microSD for about 120, 130 bucks, which is basically the price difference between the 256 and 512 model, except instead of doubling your storage size, you're quintupling it. Now again, this doesn't necessarily mean that there is no reason to upgrade. Again, the internal storage does run faster, and ultimately if you want to have as much stuff running off the system internally as possible, the 512 is going to be your best way to go about that, not to mention the fact there are extra goodies that are included with that more expensive option. But ultimately, if you just want to save some money and start off with the 256 model, or even go all the way down to the 64 and then rely on microSD for most of your games, it looks like that is a much more viable option than I originally was giving it credit to be. As always guys, if you enjoyed this video, hit the like button to let me know. Hit dislike if you didn't, it's always good info for me to have. Subscribe if you haven't yet. I am planning on doing more Steam Deck coverage, a few more in-depth videos with my experiences like this one, and maybe down the line I'll start doing a little kind of weirder stuff that you can make the system do. Until then, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.